When my own boy shoved me down those basement steps, I did not fight back and I did not yell. I just hit the bottom hard and stayed there, flat on the cold concrete, the lights off, the whole place smelling like dust and old wood. I could taste blood in my mouth, thick and metallic, and I listened to his footsteps climb back up the stairs like nothing had happened. Through the ceiling, I heard my daughter-in-law laughing, that sharp little laugh of hers bouncing between the floorboards. Then she said something that still rings in my ears, that maybe now I would finally understand the message. I was 67 years old, lying there in the dark of my own basement. My hip burned like it was on fire. My wrist felt wrong, twisted and useless, and I knew without a doubt it was broken. Still, I did not cry out for help. I did not pound on the door or beg them to come back. Instead, I reached into my pocket with my good hand, pulled out my phone, and made one single call. I kept it short. 3 words, that was all. I said, "It is time, Marcus." After that, I lay there in the darkness and waited. You are probably wondering how a man ends up stretched out at the bottom of his own basement stairs while his son and daughter-in-law joke about it upstairs. To understand that, I need to go back a ways. My name is Vincent Caruso. For the past 15 years, I have lived what most folks would call a retired life. I stay in a modest little house in Cleveland, nothing fancy, just solid and paid for. My days are simple. I read books. I go to the gym to keep my body from rusting out. Every Sunday, without fail, I visit my late wife at the cemetery and sit with her a while. At the local diner, I am that quiet older man in the corner booth, the one who leaves a good tip and keeps to himself. I do not raise my voice. I do not cause trouble. But that version of me was built, piece by piece. It was not how I started out. My son Anthony has never known what kind of work I did before he came into this world. His mother, my sweet Marie, knew everything. She was the only one who ever truly understood that side of me. When Anthony was born, she made me promise her that I would leave that life behind for good. And because I loved her more than anything, I kept that promise. I walked away clean. I changed my name. I moved to a different city. I built a new life from scratch. For 35 years, I was nothing more than Vincent Caruso, devoted husband and proud father. No one from my past knew where I had gone. That was the agreement. Then, 3 years ago, Marie died. Cancer took her quicker than I was ready for. One day we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and before I could catch my breath, she was gone from this world. Anthony mourned her, sure, but not for long. Maybe a month passed before his wife, Brittany, started planting ideas in his head about moving into my house. He told me I was alone now and that they could look after me. He said their apartment felt cramped, especially with Brittany expecting a baby. I should have noticed the shift right then, should have seen the angle they were working, but I was grieving and lonely. I missed Marie every minute of every day. I thought having family under my roof would ease that ache. That was the first mistake I made. Within 2 months, they had moved in. At the beginning, it felt harmless enough. I handed over the master bedroom to them and carried my things up to the smaller bedroom. Brittany acted thoughtful in those early days, always asking if I needed anything. Anthony seemed almost cheerful, like stepping back into his childhood home brought him comfort. Then baby Michael was born. And that is when the atmosphere in the house started to shift. Suddenly I was being told to keep my voice down because the baby was sleeping. They needed my car because theirs was having trouble again. Brittany's mother needed a place to stay for a few weeks, so would I mind sleeping down in the basement for a while? Each request grew larger than the last. Each favor felt less like a favor and more like an expectation. And I went along with it, because they were my family. Because I did not want conflict. Because I believed being a grandfather meant stepping aside and making sacrifices. About 6 months ago, I began noticing small things that did not sit right with me. Envelopes showed up addressed to businesses I had never heard of. Anthony started acting guarded whenever he used his laptop. Brittany began wearing jewelry that looked far too expensive for their situation. I may be older, but I am not senile. I started paying attention. One afternoon, Brittany had taken the baby out shopping, and Anthony was still at work. I was watching little Michael in what used to be my study. Anthony's desk was still there, and one of the drawers was not fully closed. Just slightly open, like it was inviting trouble. Inside that drawer, I found a quitclaim deed. My house had been signed over to something called Summit Property Holdings Limited Liability Company. My name was printed at the bottom with a signature that looked like mine, except I had never signed such a thing in my life. As I stood there holding that paper, a cold weight settled in my chest. My own son had forged my name. He had tried to steal the house I bought with cash 40 years ago. The house where I raised him. The house where Marie took her last breath. I kept searching. There were more documents tucked beneath it. A reverse mortgage application, also bearing a forged version of my signature. They had borrowed against my home. $340,000. The lender was not a bank. It was a company called Apex Capital Solutions. That name stirred something old inside me. Because before I became Vincent Caruso, I did certain kinds of work for certain kinds of men. Men who do not advertise their services in any phone book. Men who handle matters that never make it into a courtroom. Apex Capital Solutions was a front, a clean-looking mask for the Volkov organization. Russian. Ruthless. The sort of people you do not borrow money from unless you are either desperate or foolish. My son happened to be both. I took photographs of every document with my phone. After that, I placed each paper back exactly the way I had found it, down to the angle of the drawer. Then I went downstairs and cooked dinner like any other evening, acting as though nothing at all had changed. That night, while we sat around the table, I studied them carefully. Anthony could not bring himself to look me in the eye. Brittany kept glancing at her phone and smiling at messages she did not share. Baby Michael sat in his high chair, babbling happily, completely unaware of the corruption growing around him. "Dad," Anthony said that night, barely touching his dinner and just sliding his fork around the plate, "Brittany and I have been talking about something important." I kept eating my meatloaf, slow and steady, chewing like I had all the time in the world. I asked him what was on his mind. Brittany jumped in before he could answer, her tone sugary sweet, the kind of sweet that does not taste real. She said they thought it might be time for me to look into assisted living. According to her, I was not getting any younger, and they worried constantly about my safety. What if I fell? What if something happened while they were out of the house? I told them I appreciated the concern, because that is what you say when your own family talks to you like you are already halfway gone. Anthony went on to explain that they had found a very nice place in Akron. He said it offered activities, medical staff on site, and anything else a man my age might need. So I asked the only question that mattered. I wanted to know how much this fine establishment would cost. They looked at each other before answering. Anthony cleared his throat and said that with the equity tied up in the house, it would not be a problem. Brittany corrected him, just a little too fast. She said it was technically their house, since Anthony had grown up there. She reminded me that it was his childhood home, as if that settled something. I laid my fork down and told them I understood. That conversation happened 3 months ago. After that, the air in the house turned sour. They began acting like I was some kind of burden cluttering up their space. I was no longer free to invite anyone over. If I wanted to sit in the living room, I had to check first and make sure it did not interfere with their plans. Brittany found fault in everything I did. She complained that I breathed too loudly. She said I stayed in the bathroom too long. She acted like my very presence offended her. Anthony started coming home late most nights. Sometimes he smelled like alcohol, and when he had been drinking, his temper got sharp. 2 weeks ago, he shoved me hard enough to slam me into a wall because I accidentally woke the baby. The bruise on my shoulder was as big as a grapefruit. Last week, Brittany served me a meal that included something she knew I was allergic to. I ended up spending the night in the emergency room. She claimed it was a mistake, said she had forgotten, but I saw her eyes when she said it. There was no regret in them. They did not just want me moved out. They wanted me erased. And that brings me back to tonight. Dinner felt heavy from the start. I had cooked pot roast using Marie's old recipe. It was Sunday, and exactly 3 years had passed since she died. Like I always do, I visited her grave that morning. I told her I was sorry. Sorry that I had failed to raise our son into a better man. Halfway through the meal, Brittany dropped her fork on her plate and said the meat was overcooked. Then she looked straight at me and asked, using my first name, if there was anything I could manage to do right. She had stopped calling me Dad 2 months earlier. I told her quietly that I had followed Marie's recipe exactly. She snapped back that Marie was dead and maybe it was time I accepted that and moved on. Even Anthony looked uneasy when she said that. I told her that was out of line. She shot up from her chair and started shouting, asking if I wanted to talk about what was out of line. She accused me of sitting in the house all day contributing nothing, eating their food, using their utilities. I calmly reminded her that it was my house and my food. I told her that was an interesting way to phrase things. Anthony narrowed his eyes and demanded to know what I meant by that. I could have kept my mouth shut. Maybe I should have. But I was worn down to the bone. I was tired of being treated like a trespasser in the home I paid for. I was tired of watching my son turn into someone I did not recognize. So I told them I knew about Summit Property Holdings. I told them I had seen the quitclaim deed with my forged signature. I mentioned the reverse mortgage. And I made it clear that I knew exactly who had loaned them the $340,000. Anthony went pale right there at the table. Brittany, though, recovered quicker. She accused me of snooping through their belongings. I corrected her. I said those were my documents in my house that they were trying to steal. Anthony stood up so fast his chair crashed onto the floor behind him. He said I did not understand. He claimed they had planned to tell me. I asked him if they had also planned to tell me before or after forging my signature. Before or after borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Russian criminals. I wanted to know what they needed that kind of money for. Brittany's face twisted with anger. She called me self-righteous and said I had no idea what it cost to raise a child or even to live in this world. I asked her again what was so important that it justified gambling away my house. Was it her expensive jewelry? Was it Anthony's gambling debts? What exactly made it worth selling the roof out from over my head? Anthony shouted that it was not my house anymore. He said the deed had been filed and the matter was finished. Then he sneered and said I could not prove the signature was forged. He asked who would believe a senile old man. That was when it happened. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs. Anthony stepped toward me, placed both hands flat against my chest, and shoved with everything he had. I lost my balance and fell backward into the dark. I rolled down all 13 steps and crashed into a pile at the bottom like a sack of old bones. The pain hit me all at once, sharp and blinding, like somebody flipped a switch inside my body. My hip throbbed. My wrist screamed. My ribs felt like they were wrapped in fire. Everything hurt. From upstairs, I heard Brittany laugh. Then her voice floated down, saying maybe now I would finally understand. Anthony sounded unsure when he asked if I was dead. She answered like it did not matter and told him to help her with the baby because they were going out. A moment later, their footsteps drifted away. The front door shut. The house went completely still. I lay there in the dark and took stock of the damage. My hip was probably fractured. My wrist was almost certainly broken. My ribs were bruised, maybe cracked. I could feel blood on my head somewhere, but I was still conscious. And I was angry. With my good hand, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not touched in 35 years. Marcus picked up on the first ring. He sounded surprised to hear my voice. He said he thought I had been dead by now. I told him not yet. Then I said the words I had already decided on. I told him it was time. He paused for a second and reminded me that once that door opens, it does not close halfway. I told him I was certain. He asked for the details. So I gave him everything. I explained about the house. I told him about the forged paperwork, the loan from Alexei Volkov, and Anthony and Brittany's plan to have me declared incompetent or simply let nature take its course. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a beat. Then he let out a low laugh. He said my son had borrowed from Alexei Volkov and called that a foolish move. He asked if I understood what that meant. I told him I understood perfectly. He said he would make a few calls and told me to stay put. I ended the call and closed my eyes. The pain was fierce, but I had felt worse in another lifetime. Back then, broken bones were just part of the job description. That was the part of me Anthony never knew about. The father who coached his little league team and showed up to every parent-teacher conference was real. But he was not the whole story. Before my son was born, before I ever laid eyes on Marie, I lived under a different name. I did work that would keep a man awake at night if he knew about it. They called me a cleaner. When something needed to disappear without a trace, I handled it. I worked for the DeMarco family out of Newark for 20 years. In all that time, I was never caught, never questioned, never tied to anything. I was a shadow. Then Marie came into my life and gave me a choice. It was either that world or her. I chose her without hesitation. DeMarco let me walk away because I had been loyal and profitable, and because he respected a man who chose love over blood money. I built a new identity as Vincent Caruso. I found honest work. I raised a son. I lived clean. And for 35 years, nobody from that world knew where I was. Nobody except Marcus. He had been my partner back then, the only man from that life I ever trusted. When I left, he stayed and climbed the ladder. The last I heard, he was running most of DeMarco's East Coast operations. That night, I had called in a favor that had been waiting for 35 years. After that, all I could do was wait. At some point, the pain must have knocked me out. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight was cutting through the basement window. It was morning. The second I tried to move, I regretted it. My phone showed 6 missed calls from Anthony. I figured he had started worrying about what kind of legal trouble he might face if I was actually dead. Upstairs, I heard the front door open. Footsteps crossed the floor. Then the basement door creaked. Anthony called down, his voice shaking, asking if I was there. I stayed quiet. I heard him panic. He told Brittany to call emergency services. She hissed back at him and told him he was crazy. She reminded him that if I told anyone what happened, they would be finished. She said it was an accident, that I fell, but he pointed out the bruises from the week before. They argued in low, frantic whispers. Then Brittany's voice turned cold. She said they should wait. She said if I was not dead yet, I would be soon enough. Old men die from falls every day. They could simply say they found me in the morning. Anthony said that was murder. She answered that it was survival. She reminded him about Volkov's people and asked if he wanted them to discover the money was gone. She said this was their only way out. There was a long stretch of silence. Then Anthony's footsteps moved away. The basement door shut. They were going to let me die down there. My own son. A little while later, my phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. He said he was in town and that the situation was handled. He told me to stay where I was. About 6 hours after that, I heard vehicles pull up outside the house. Heavy boots crossed the porch. The front door burst open upstairs. Anthony shouted, his voice full of fear. Another voice cut him off, sharp and commanding, with a Russian accent. The stranger told him to sit down and be quiet. Anthony demanded to know who they were and said they could not just break into his house. The Russian laughed and corrected him. He said the house belonged to Apex Capital Solutions now, since the paperwork had been signed when the loan was taken. He asked if Anthony had forgotten. Anthony tried to bargain, saying they just needed more time to pay it back. The Russian replied that time costs money, and Anthony was out of both. I heard Brittany scream and tell them not to touch her. One of the men asked where I was. She said I had fallen and was in the basement, maybe dead. Boots pounded down the stairs. The light snapped on, and I squinted up at 3 men standing over me. One of them was Marcus. He looked almost the same as I remembered, just a little gray at the temples. The 2 men standing behind Marcus were built like brick walls. Russian enforcers, no doubt about it. Marcus crouched down beside me and looked me over. He said I looked terrible. I told him I felt worse than I looked. He signaled to the Russians, and they lifted me up with surprising care. They handled me like professionals, steady and controlled, then carried me up the stairs. When we reached the living room, I saw Anthony and Brittany sitting stiff on the couch. 4 more Russian men surrounded them. And standing near the window was Alexei Volkov himself. I recognized him right away from years ago. He had aged, sure. His hair had turned gray. But his pale blue eyes were still ice cold. He looked at me, battered and bleeding, and gave a thin smile. He said he had heard I was dead. Through the pain, I told him the rumors had been exaggerated. Marcus explained that the 2 people on the couch were my son and daughter-in-law and that they were responsible for what had happened to me. I told Volkov plainly that they had pushed me down the stairs. I told him they forged my name on legal documents to steal my house and borrowed money from him with no intention of paying it back. The smile disappeared from Volkov's face. He turned slowly toward Anthony and Brittany and asked if it was true. Anthony tried to explain it away, stammering that it was not what it seemed and that they had planned to repay the loan. Volkov cut him off. He said the money had been spent on jewelry and gambling debts. Marcus had already shown him the receipts. Volkov stood up straight and reminded them they had taken $340,000 and paid back nothing. Worse than that, they used a stolen house as collateral. Anthony begged for more time. Volkov shook his head and told his men to take them. Brittany let out a scream and said they could not do that because they had a baby. Volkov replied calmly that the child would be placed with Child Protective Services unless I decided otherwise. Then he turned to me and asked what I wanted done with them. Every person in that room looked at me. Anthony had tears running down his face now. Brittany looked pale and shaken. I thought about everything. The lies. The forged papers. The way they treated me. The push down the stairs. The plan to let me die in the basement. I also thought about Marie and what kind of man she had wanted me to be. I said I wanted my house returned to me. I wanted the deed corrected immediately. And I wanted them out of my home that very day. That was all. Volkov looked almost disappointed. He asked if that was truly all I wanted. He reminded me they still owed him money. I told him they would repay every dollar, but not with my house. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded. Out of respect for who I used to be, he said he would agree. But the debt would be paid with interest. If they missed even one payment, they would belong to him. I nodded back. Volkov turned to Anthony and Brittany and told them they had 1 hour to pack and leave. He made it clear that the house belonged to me again. They would pay him $5,000 every month for 68 months. If they failed once, he would collect in other ways. Brittany whispered that they could not afford that kind of payment. Volkov told her to work harder. He said they could get second jobs, sell their possessions, do whatever it took. He did not care, as long as he got his money. The Russians escorted them upstairs to pack. I could hear Brittany crying and Anthony trying to reason with men who were not interested in reason. Marcus helped me into a chair. He said I needed medical attention. I told him I needed a minute first. We sat there quietly while Volkov's men went through the house, removing any trace of Summit Property Holdings. One of them handed me the original deed, properly recorded and restored to my name. Exactly 1 hour later, Anthony and Brittany came downstairs with suitcases. Baby Michael was strapped into his carrier. Anthony would not look at me. Brittany glared at me with nothing but hatred in her eyes. Anthony asked softly if I was really going to let this happen. I asked him what exactly he thought was happening. Being held accountable for his choices was not injustice. He reminded me that he was my son. I reminded him that he had pushed me down a flight of stairs, forged my signature, stolen my property, and planned to let me die alone in a basement. I leaned forward, even though it sent a spike of pain through my body, and told him that he stopped being my son the moment he chose that path. He tried to say they needed the money. I told him that everybody needs money. Not everybody becomes a thief and attempts murder to get it. Brittany grabbed the baby carrier and said this was not over. I told her quietly that it was. They walked out of the house. Volkov's men followed them. When the door shut, the place felt hollow and still. Marcus sat down across from me and said I had gone soft. He reminded me that years ago I would have handled that situation very differently. I told him that years ago I did not have a conscience. Marie gave me one. He warned me they might talk about what happened, might tell their version of events. I said they could try. Who would believe a couple who forged legal documents and borrowed money from Russian criminals? They would sound unhinged. Marcus smiled and said I was still sharp. He said he was glad I had called him. He stood up and told me to get to a hospital. Then he looked at me one last time and said I should stay retired because the world is different now. Marcus gave a short nod and said the world had gotten messy over the years, and that I would not enjoy stepping back into it. I told him I had no intention of returning to that life. This was a one-time favor, nothing more. He seemed satisfied with that. As he reached the door, he stopped and asked if I thought my son would learn anything from all this. I told him honestly that I did not know, and that it was no longer my concern. When Marcus left, the house was quiet again. I sat there alone, feeling every injury. My hip burned like fire. My wrist was swollen and useless. My head throbbed in a way that told me I probably had a concussion. But for the first time in 2 years, the house felt like mine again. Truly mine. After sitting there a while, I called for an ambulance. At the hospital, they ran every scan they could think of. The verdict was a fractured hip, a broken wrist, 3 cracked ribs, and a mild concussion. The doctor asked how it happened. I told him I fell down the stairs. He suggested someone should stay with me during recovery and asked if I had family. I told him no. I said I did not have family. They kept me there for 3 days. When I returned home, the place was spotless. Someone had been through every room. There was no trace of Anthony or Brittany anywhere. Even the scuff marks on the wall from when I hit it weeks earlier had been painted over. A note sat on the kitchen table, written in Marcus's familiar handwriting. It said the nursery furniture had been placed in storage and that when I felt ready, I should give it to someone who deserved it. He signed it with just an initial. I walked into the empty nursery and stood there with my cane. That room had been meant for my grandson. It was supposed to hold his crib, his toys, his future. But that child was being raised by 2 people who lied, stole, and tried to let an old man die at the bottom of a staircase. Maybe hardship would teach them something while they worked off their debt. Maybe paying back Volkov month after month would change them. Or maybe it would not. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility. I sold the nursery furniture to a young couple who lived down the street. They were expecting their first baby and looked at each other the way Marie and I used to. I used the money to buy fresh flowers for my wife's grave. Standing there in the cemetery, I told her I had broken my promise. I said I reached back into the old world, the one I swore I left behind. But I told her it had been necessary. I asked her to understand. The wind moved through the trees just then, and I chose to take that as her answer. That was 6 months ago. Anthony and Brittany have been making their payments to Volkov. I know because Marcus keeps me informed. They are working more than one job each. They are living in a small apartment. They are struggling. But they are paying. They have not tried to call me. I have not tried to reach them either. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have handled it differently. Maybe I could have been gentler. Maybe I could have forgiven more. Then I shift in my chair and feel that deep ache in my hip. I remember lying in the dark, listening to them laugh. I remember hearing them debate whether to let me die. No. I did what had to be done. I am 78 years old now. I have lived long enough to do both terrible and beautiful things. I raised a son who turned into someone I do not recognize. I loved a woman who pulled me out of darkness and gave me a conscience. And I learned something important. The quiet ones are often the most dangerous, not because we crave trouble, but because we understand exactly what we are capable of. Last week, I saw Brittany at the grocery store. She noticed me first. She froze like she had seen a ghost, then turned her cart around and walked the other way. The cart was filled with store-brand food and the cheapest cuts of meat. She looked worn down and older than her years. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel triumph. I felt nothing at all. And that emptiness told me more than any emotion could. It told me I made the right choice. Some folks believe family means forgiving anything. They think blood excuses betrayal. Those people have never been pushed down a flight of stairs by their own child. I live alone now. The house is mine again. I keep my routines. I enjoy the quiet. Every Sunday, I visit Marie and tell her about my week. I may not have family anymore, but I have peace. And at my age, peace is worth more than anything money can buy.